Hello, Acid Horizon listeners, and welcome back. This week, we are speaking with Alex Charnley and Michael Richmond on their book, Fascism and the Women's Cause. And I just wanted to direct your attention to our YouTube channel. Recently, we have decided to do more video programming. This particular episode is audio only. However, our most recent episode with Stuart Kendall can be seen on video. Also, if you turn to my personal channel, Left Hand, you'll see that I have added some video content as well. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you would like to see some of these episodes on video. Almost all of these videos and discussions come directly to you through our Patreon page. Many of you are already subscribed, and we just want to say thank you. If you are not subscribed yet, well, now is certainly the time. Okay, let's take a listen to Adam as he interviews Alex and Michael.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. We have had kind of an unofficial series on here in terms of histories of sexual liberation across the Anglophone world and beyond. And previously we had, for example, Alex Stoffelwand talk about Eros and Empire, the internationalist struggle for sexual liberation, both within and beyond the United States. We had Billy Cashmore and Maddie Colquhoun to talk about the philosophy and the political valence of queerness as a concept. And also, most recently, we had Juliana Gleason on to talk about her history of intersex liberation. But liberation, sadly, doesn't always produce comrades. Sometimes things have gone in weirder directions. There have always been histories of liberation, histories of reaction, both above and beyond and within the left itself. And for this, actually, we wanted to get on two historians of, not just historians of reaction, but historians of the left in general, but definitely some of the parts in which histories of the left sometimes want to keep at the side, especially these quote-unquote debates are still quite live in various discursive and online spaces today. And we're going to be talking about the new book from Michael Richmond and Alex Charnley. We have Fascism and the Women's Cause, out now from our good friends over at Ebb Magazine, Ebb Press, which is actually the sequel to another book which everyone should read, Fuck the Vampire's Castle, This is a State, Fractured, Race, Class, and the Hatred of Identity Politics. Alex, Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting us.
I just wanted to start off by talking about sort of the context of this book, where it came from, because obviously previously with your book Fractured, you was looking into how various dynamics of racial capitalism has played in developing the relationship of the left to the concept of race and to marginalized people, and various kinds of immigration crackdowns, such as in the 1910s with the British Aliens Act, which for listeners who don't know, essentially was a racist law preventing Jewish migration to the United Kingdom from pogroms happening in Eastern Europe. And that was partially supported in some instances by the trade union movement, and all the way through contemporary debates or the so-called anti-IDPOL left, who listeners are usually funded by fascists, let's be honest. But generally just looking at the contours of how racial capitalism impacts leftist discourses today. And for this, the second book, Fascism and the Women's Cause, you've actually turned to the history of liberatory movements around sexual liberation, particularly in the context of the post-Civil War Reconstructionary United States, and the early 1900s suffragette movement today. Just want to know what sort of circumstances that led you towards putting this book together?
I think the two books are kind of connected quite strongly. I mean, Fractured came out of a lot of historical research around different historical scenes, which is the kind of simplest way to put it. Two of those scenes was British and American feminism, and in particular, the kind of, as you say, the 19th century scene in Britain, and the early 1900s Edwardian kind of transition to that. And the American scene, abolition and fractures for both movements. This is the term fractured. What we wanted to do really with that first book is address contemporary discourses at the time from about 2016 onwards, which we're looking or using identity politics as a kind of pejorative concept. Didn't even need to explain. It was just something people said. And what it meant was a break with universalist tradition. And it could be used in all different ways, in all different movements. We kind of major stem to that was transphobia in the left as well, not just in socialist scenes, but in anarchist scenes. And what we wanted to do is bring some light to that. It's very easy to get racked in these discourses with people you don't really want to have conversations with, because, we hope with critique that if we critique, you want to preserve something of some of what you're critiquing, but often that wasn't the case. But you had to address it because it was creating in grassroots kind of circles actually lots of division and lots of problems. Yeah, so we had these two scenes in the women's movement, but we couldn't really explore in full detail some of the things we wanted to explore. So there was aspects of those historical scenes we left out and we brought later on into Fascism in the Women's Cause at a later point. And that was about 2022. Both books really are dealing with reactions to identity, ideological slippages between left liberal and far right politics, and trying to take really seriously that the left is also a product of its division and get away, I suppose, for a lot of essentialist thinking on the left around noble traditions, whether they're political, in movement to sexual liberation, or in anti-racism even, and take those divisions really seriously as a kind of heuristic to think about where we are or where we're at.
In Fractured, we took a very kind of historical and kind of class compositional approach to the question of the ways that people talked about identity politics, the ways that discourse functioned, and we wanted to drag things back into a kind of a longue durée kind of look at, where do these divisions in the working class actually come from? What was kind of left over and went into fascism and the women's cause was a lot of the research that we'd done into the involvement of women in fascist movements. And, you know, when we were writing Fractured, we ended up like a ridiculously long manuscript that our editor at Pluto, Nader Tehrani, magically helped us to cut by a third to make it passable as a book. And so that was one of the victims on the chopping block. But we decided to write an essay about using some of that research because we thought the research was valuable and it spoke to a lot of the things we were seeing happening in movements now, particularly around gender critical feminism, but also, you know, more generally in terms of like the relationships and the kind of the slippages, the kind of the individual kind of trajectories of figures from our own movements or in our times, the things that we have all witnessed in the last decade or more of being on the left. And we felt that, you know, some of the grounding, that the kind of research that we've done was useful to give us a kind of a deeper historical perspective over these issues and then to kind of thicken out some of our ideas about fascism and about feminism more broadly. And so we wrote that essay and published it on LibCom. And then when Ebb approached us, they actually did something that was very novel for us, which is they asked us to write more. And so we went about a year or a year and a half kind of expanding it into a short book, but then that extra research was really interesting, really fun, and it allowed us to really like develop a lot more kind of analysis on top of what a lot of which was kind of historical, but a lot kind of particularly Alex to really get to work on it. Considering, you know, what was going on in our lives, I think we were both pretty happy that we were able to with what we were able to produce.
One of the things I want to get to, because I want to start a little bit more the theory before we get to the practice is far away, but we'll get the theory first, then we get the history. The book does want to intervene in a historiographical debate around the possibility of describing anything as a fascist feminism, which many comrades, you know, rightfully would say like a contradiction in terms. One of the interesting things about your argument in this book is not so much that, you know, there's like an ideological constellation that is feminism that is inherently liable towards fascism. It's not taking sort of the route of just saying, you know, Dworkin was a Zionist, you know, QED. Because let's be honest, that every leftist thinker would have we wouldn't have any left. Everyone seems to have kind of after, I mean, you know, thinking about what Marx said about Lassalle, for example, but just in terms of the historiographical debate around the possibility of fascist feminism, one of the things I found really interesting is that you both sort of articulate that the possibility of this term making any sense has to be only in the historical context of there are many feminisms, and particularly the possibility or the actuality of a liberal feminism, something which I think everyone sort of can really recognize. It itself entails the possibility of a fascist feminism if you take liberalism properly seriously in sort of the Marxist context, or at least in the context of understanding more of an open or stretched Marxism, as I think some comrades in RSC1 call it, understanding the racial element to the whole capitalist project and therefore to liberalism in general. I was wondering if we could just unpack that argument a little bit, just talking about the possibility of describing anything with the terms, you know, fascist feminist.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off. I think, where this discussion came from, this motivation to really look at that, there was a really good conversation and interview between Sophie Lewis and Acis Harrison in the Transgender Journal. And they go into that question and just put it out there and say, why is there so much reticence around looking at these forms of feminism that aren't just racist, that aren't just in bed with fascism, but actually have a certain kind of extension into fascist politics that's very deliberate and very instrumental. And it's not at the same time losing that quality or that integration of an idea of women's autonomy within it. I think that's a really key thing, that around theories of white womanhood, there's really, there's lots of work, I'm sure Mike will speak about that in a minute, to kind of look at white feminism and its historical bearings. And that's kind of part of what we do as well. We were kind of really motivated by this discussion to bring that with the research we'd already done and kind of really explore that and say, well, okay, if that is the hypothesis, if that it's not just that there's feminist movements in whatever wave or so-called wave of feminism or whatever period that kind of find their way in collaboration or in alliance with similar kind of, things we get today, gender critical feminists, they're in alliance with perhaps fascists or evangelicals, but they're not themselves fascist. They're not part of a fascist movement. They're sort of kind of misdirected there. I suppose we wanted to kind of take on that problem and say, well, what if there's a sort of deliberate attempt here to kind of integrate with a politics, and what is the self-activity of feminists in fascism or kind of in projects we would assume or call fascist? Yeah, we explore that in two ways. We historically specify, first of all, that there is a clear transition and evidenced and recorded transition by many historians, feminist historians of fascism, doing this for a long time, in Italian fascist movement, German fascist movements, in the US and in Britain. And we concentrate on this work. Kathleen Blee, Nancy McLean in the US, and other feminists in Britain who kind of explore women's roles and women's trajectories from feminist movements into actual organized fascist groups. So first of all, there's a sort of evidence there that this is taking place. And then there's way we theorize that sort of integration and why it happens. And then the other aspect of it is, if it happens there, can it just happen again? Is this a recursive problem? And we relate this to, gender critical formations, and how do you understand those formations as fascism? I suppose on the theoretical point, the kind of provisional way we do this is to argue that Enzo Traverso has this line, which is taken up by Saracen and Sophie Lewis as well to some extent in this discussion, that's like, well, they're post-fascist, gender critical, these new movements of fascism since post-89 politics, there's a sort of bricolage taking place where they're post-fascist movements. They're not kind of deliberately ideological in what we'd understand historical fascism to be. And I think part of the weakness of that division for Traverso is that he then has quite a straightforward understanding of what the historical fascist movements were like, that, women are subjected in those movements, but women can be more active in these later post-fascist movements. And what we were looking at historical evidence and saying, well, that's not quite the case. And many feminist historians have argued that women had a far more instrumental role in that period, partly because women's, insurrectionary politics was kind of so active, in the 19th century, not just in the countries we look at, but we look at Ireland as well. The same kind of splits are going on where anti-colonial women's movements there split off in Ireland around the imposition of the British treaty, and women's anti-treaty IRA women's movements in that incredibly central and radical and militant, and not just in supportive or social reproductive roles, but in fighting roles. And it's more complex really than it's given the time of day for, I suppose. So we have this historical specific transition, and then we have this theoretical one, and our working alternative, if you like, to the Enzo Traverso's point there is that we see these, can we understand fascist feminisms as forms of appearance of fascism? What we mean by that is that within feminism, if we think of feminism, what's authentic to feminism is actually the fact that it includes forms of appearances of fascism as well, and a full spectrum of political movements. So Marxist, communist, anti-colonial, liberal feminisms. But this link to liberal feminism, and we kind of show this in different ways in the book, is the easier transition. If you have white supremacist politics within liberal feminism, there's an easier transition into fascism from that point. But it's also sort of distinct as well. And we were trying to kind of work with that really, of if that's the hypothesis, how do we examine it historically and start to give concrete arguments about how those things take place? What do you reckon, Mike? Is that a sort of roughly where we're at theoretically with it?
And also that it has to theoretically develop from the specificity of those different contexts. And so in some ways, discussion of fascist feminism in Germany or Italy is a discussion that involves the taking of state power and to an earlier or later degree. And, our focus is much more on, for example, the women's Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s or the British Union of Fascists in the early 1930s. And we're talking about quite large movements, particularly the Ku Klux Klan and the women's involvement in the Ku Klux Klan. I think people are often quite shocked when they find out how widespread those movements were and how many women were involved in them. But also that these were not, look, I think if you look at the German context, you have a widespread kind of constellation of different kinds of women's movements in the Weimar period, which ranged from different types of liberal feminist things, the kind of trajectories similar trajectories to what you're seeing in Britain. So a lot of focus around things like trying to control class women, anti-sex work, and focus on controlling venereal disease, eugenic projects, things like that. I remember when we were writing in Fractured about the Black Horror on the Rhine, which is in 1920, when you have, after the Versailles Treaty, you have France taking control of the Rhineland and deploying Black French colonial troops as part of the occupying forces there. And you have, a very campaign by conservative and far-right German movements, including a lot of women's movements and their kind of interrelation with local government stuff. And they're able to reach out to the sympathies of other European whites, including a large part of the British left, who are horrified at the idea that Black African troops have power, the defeated kind of white German population, that they have proximity to white women and things like that. And the kinds of women's groups active in the 1920s in Germany are doing similar work to what the groups are in the 1920s in Britain. But what happens is that when the Nazis come to power in 1933, you have a very forcible endpoint to say these groups will either be dissolved, obviously the socialist, communist and Jewish ones, or they'll be integrated into the one sanctioned Nazi women's group. And that is a kind of categorical difference from the histories that we're looking at, because the context allows for this spectrum of organizations to maintain. But you do have that in the British Union of Fascists, and you have that in the WKKK. What you have is organizations ascending to primary, reactionary organization at the time that they take over. And basically a lot of the other far-right women's organizations do get folded into those organizations, but you don't have state power doing it. And therefore you don't have that kind of uniformity.
It leads brilliant to my next question, because one of the things that I found so shocking reading about the second KKK, one that there was a second one, typical American extravagance, they have two of them, but also just like how familiar it looks in terms of thinking about, not in terms of the German and Italian context, but in terms of the current Anglophone mobilization of gender critical fascism. I just want to quote from the book. The second KKK is perhaps even more relevant to how we understand fascist mobilization today, because a highly developed and resilient democratic infrastructure offered members extraordinary organizing opportunities to exploit the proceeds of racial capitalism without, quote unquote, overturning democracy. And in terms of at least a model of organization here, because we're not doing a history of the theories, not doing a history of feminism, like someone wrote this book and therefore it became more slanted this way. You're doing a history of, you're doing a movement history, a history of organizations and the organizing of things around the women's cause. The idea that we will organize around your interests insofar as you see yourself as in this category and we see you as being in that category as well. How do we understand then something like the women's KKK, or at least and as a part of the wider KKK movement in the States? Because one of the things that's just so shocking to me is just how big it got. to most people today, even if you live in the States, especially if you live far away from the kind of racialized violence that the KKK is still enacting, they're just like a joke on Jerry Springer. They're an Easter egg in the movie Sinners, but actually this was a huge civil society organization. It wasn't a conspiratorial one. It had a seemingly relatively diverse class basis, but traditionally mostly middle and downwardly mobile. How do we understand that in terms of a force of mobilization that was able to both capture or even articulate its own version of that cause?
I'll try and be short on this, and you just cut in whenever as well, Mike. But I think when we research this, I mean, we start with Kathleen Bleed's really important work, and her focus is regional around Indiana, where it was a central mobilizing point for the second KKK. And what's very interesting about her writing about that is that she does interviews with women who were in it in the 80s, and it's exactly as you say, Adam. There's a sense in these interviews and conversations that this was just an ordinary thing. It's nothing also to be looked back in to be ashamed of at all. This was actually there's a nostalgic quality to those memories. So there's that thing already, which is about how this movement sort of was part of the organic formation of civil society at that point. There was an emergent middle class. There were crises as well, or precarity. And if you looked, there's a lot of we use a lot of regional studies to look at the different kind of class composition, and it is very different and it is mixed, except for the fact that it was 100% Protestant movement. That was kind of what was its essential basis to it. It was kind of part of what that movement was a reaction against a notion that whiteness had become mixed. That they wanted the certain kind of purity of a Protestant settler colonial first people here sort of purity. That got the movement into trouble to some extent, because then they went to war with everybody. So Italians, Irish, Black people, obviously a strong anti-Semitic part of that movement. But I think this is the aspect of it that, people understand the KKK. This is certainly extreme. The ideological warfare of that group is extreme, but it had a very ordinary kind of lifestyle culture. And attached to that, which I think is really important for us, is a key parallel, is its fraternal form of organization, that it sort of subsumed and took over all the clubs. Massive rise in women's clubs, temperance movements, and suffrage movements. Lots of the temperance movements were really invested in civil society pursuits. There was Quaker movements and Quaker women that ended up as in temperance and then into KKK, and preachers. You had this religious aspect, but a very commercial kind of culture that was also anti-consumerist. Its morality was anti-consumerism. Its morality was anti-change at that time. It was anti-music. It's sort of kind of politics of degeneracy in that sense, but also it was totally commercial in its operation, had an insurance side to the company. It's selling robes was part of its enterprise. And then there's loads of scandals around embezzlement that came from that. That is the aspect for us, really, that it did grow through this commercial, what we call commercial fascism, a form of quite distinct commercial fascism where the commercial mediation grew it, whether it's through the kind of evangelical industries that were emerging at the time, or through these relationships to manufacturer or life insurance, which was kind of, becoming part of that bedrock. And the Masonic halls or the groups that, they kind of subsumed within it. So the parallels are there in that sense, I think, of what's going on today, that there's this sort of organic immersion through groups. But, the difference today, obviously, it's online and digital, but the parallels we felt were there because there is this immersion within civic societal infrastructure that made it very different, as Mike was saying earlier, to Germany and Italy, this kind of run for the state. I don't know what you think about that, Mike.
Also, in the context for the second KKK, in terms of its difference from the first, being that the first was, essentially kind of white Southern cross-class, but very much elite-led movement to try and overthrow any of the gains of Black Southern, the general strike of the slaves, as Du Bois refers to it, the kind of emancipatory wins in the aftermath of Reconstruction. And in the second KKK is taking place, it's formed during the First World War in the context of American imperial ascent, and it marched to a global power, but also a period of huge kind of tumult of like huge working class movements, black radical movements. And for our context, it's happening right at the time when women are enfranchised. And so the Klan is kind of already unrecognizable from the earlier iteration, but when it's kind of presented with this new reality of women having the vote, and it basically has to make a decision about whether it wants to continue with basic approach of the first Klan, which is to fully exclude women. And as an organization whose political modus operandi and strategy is very dependent on electoralism, even if it's not, running candidates as a party itself, it knows that it has to be an organization that takes seriously the political rights of women and the activity of women in social movements that has been growing since the early suffrage movements. Alex spoke before about kind of the fraternal orders, and I think, it's probably quite an alien concept to us, or a bit of a kind of a weird thing. Like maybe it's like kind of Freemasons or kind of quite obscure and secretive, but actually fraternal orders were like the form of organization for that period, for the late 19th, early 20th century America. Women's and men's, usually kind of gendered organizations for all different types of causes were huge. Some of them contained hundreds of thousands of members. There were a large number of women's organizations who we would think of, looking at their programs, as far right, and yet that the politics of so many late 19th century, early 20th century organizations that might have overlaps with church groups or labor organizations or other civil society organizations were also eugenicist organizations, or were completely excluded certain racialized groups from membership. So these were normal organizations of liberal American society. On the one hand, the Ku Klux Klan kind of fit into that as just another one, but also through its success, partly through the quasi-leadership of a man and a woman who basically joined from a public relations firm in Atlanta, grew to such a size through their kind of commercial success that they were able to attract millions of people nationally to the organization, including over 500,000 women. And the majority of those members were in the northern states of the US. So it completely kind of goes against a lot of what many people's preconceptions about what the Klan is and who it appeals to.
Yeah, and it's what I found interesting about the Klan as well, just how much world building there is. You say like this integrating into PR. They are, fascists are often early adopters of communications and media technology. I mean, not just thinking like Goebbels, at least in terms of social media. I mean, organizations like Stormfront, Twitter, the print technologies, both being a vehicle for communist newspapers, but also reactionary newspaper people like Julius Streicher, Rupert Murdoch, and I do consider them to be in the same category. They will leave that category when they stop acting like it. This American model, which already has kind of developed liberalism, it's not trying to necessarily compete with an ancien regime or an embedded aristocracy, does define the evangelical networks of the age of social media, also things like QAnon, but also just how many, TERFs get money from the Heritage Foundation. They do get money from these evangelical networks, and they do all tie each other together with quite horrifying results. In terms of, it's hard not to think about this in terms of just a general way of rallying the workers of social reproductive unpaid labor, i.e. women, to the cause of a kind of white nationalism, because that becomes the nationalist capture, or the racial capitalist capture of that project. And it just feels like this does seem to reoccur so much. It's not that these groups are forming because there's the ontological category of woman has this tendency towards reaction. No, not of course. It's because when you rally organized workers around reproducing society, there is that ideological, or we can call it libidinal, pull of the nation. And it really, when you talk about the northern states, particularly in terms of reading some of the things that, Susan B. Anthony said in the earlier days of the women's suffrage movement, this kind of exchange of, we participate in the polis on the basis that we need to, if black men are getting enfranchised, and of course this rhetoric by its very nature has to exclude black women and indigenous women. And we see this in the history of American civil rights movements where these are not included. I mean, people like Sojourner Truth are included kind of relatively tokenistic measure, but it doesn't cover the antagonisms women like her had with the rest of that movement. I mean, it's shocking the lack of historical consciousness, I guess, that at least myself that I brought into it. But I just wanted to ask with particularly the KKK, I mean, how you see this playing out today? Do you think this has given them a model in terms of the absolute backlash to any emancipatory role for sexual liberation in the United States?
It's kind of an open question now, isn't it? I mean, what we talk about here and at the time we're writing, it seemed pretty clear that after Trump's first term and it sort of got defeated but the George Floyd rebellion had a kind of instructive effect where the backlash was, right, we're going to water the base around critical race theory and around transphobia and organize it at state by state level. I think the parallels are there for that model of kitchen activism that's just been a part of conservative movements in the US for a long time. We're going to organize through the schools. We're going to organize and base build. We're going to water the base. This just seemed to be, what the project was for those 4 years up to this Trump 2.0, where you get this more executive sort of fascism with that. And the states that are on board, and the states that are not on board, well, the executive can kind of pull federal funding and you kind of use that to get them on board. So it seems like there's a project here. What we're in now with Trump, the geopolitics of it is quite new. But that sort of base building that went on around sexual politics, around parental concern, that's kind of crossed over with Britain as well and become part of kind of the Anglophone kind of natalist international, really, a kind of fascist international with gender criticals absolutely central to it. You look at like gender criticals in Britain and how they were really early on board of this, and evangelicals within the far right were in the US kind of catching on and going, well, actually we can go through this stream. When we look back on it in 5 years or so, I think we'll find that many liberal women in professions in Britain, but also second wave feminists and a mix of feminists and non-feminists who then kind of had felt their status threatened in Britain's institutions, have been part of an organized transphobic wave, which is fascist and that has played an incredibly important role in working through civic institutions and making organized transphobia state law. There's that aspect. And, within the second KKK, loads of world building, a sort of cult-based lifestyle scheme of social reproduction as well, through insurance systems and the rest. But I suppose what we have to account for here is the role also of kind of professional, institutionalized liberal feminism. And is it that the liberal gender critical feminism that tries to take a kind of respectable line is a different franchise within this whole ecosystem of fascism? Or is it proximate to, or is it in fact absolutely central to these fascist projects? And, I think in the end, it's the latter really, when we kind of look at how integrated and how effective these arguments have been, these appearances of a liberal feminism as just protecting women, how important that's been to this project. I don't think really, even in the US, certainly not in Britain, that the sort of reach that's been achieved could have been achieved without this respectable format of we're just protecting women, we're just protecting women and girls, we're just protecting children. So there's these parallels in the KKK, but the key thing for us has always been really around this project. What are these liberal artifacts of politics? What are the liberal formation within racial capitalism? How does it contribute that form of white supremacy to a fascist organization of white supremacy? And it seems that these are the dynamics we have to really take seriously in that sense. And that was kind of the motivation to do these historical scenes.
One of the things I really appreciate as well in the chapters, because I know we've already mentioned material about this in the British context historically, but one of the points I really think you both bring up so well is the fascist appropriation of the women's cause often exploits a distinction between rebellion and conformity, or to an extent you can have like a rebellious conformity where capital is, it's eroding the bound of its own social reproduction. So there's a kind of rebellious conforming to the ideal, the moral ideal, or the bourgeois ideal of gender. And this is really hemmed up in the particular roots around so-called Victorian sort of purity reformers, but also just particularly to take some of the most famous examples within the famous suffragist Pankhurst family, where we have Emily and Christabel giving us kind of empire-light version of a women's political party where we will not say anything about Ireland. We'll support you in what you're doing on Ireland in exchange for this, versus someone like Sylvia Pankhurst, who remains a firm communist, becomes an even firmer communist still throughout her life. And then we have, I can't remember the name of the fourth one, sorry, Adela, who also becomes a communist, but then also founds a fascist party in Australia. So you can see it was the same sort of family, a classic sort of leftist division where under the conditions of liberalism, certain tendencies become radicalized in one direction, some tendencies become radicalized in another, and it's just because liberalism is ineffectual to deliver liberation. And so these tendencies just end up appearing. I was wondering if we could unpack this a little bit in terms of particularly the British context of the suffragist versus suffragette movement, because there was a case people have been saying now with the recent prescription of the soon to be attempted prescription. I don't know if it will be prescribed at the time it comes out. Even if they are prescribed when it comes out, big up's Palestine action, they can't arrest us all anyway. They can't arrest us all anyway. But there was these like heavily prescribed, basically militarily assaulted people were, suffragettes were, forced to out of hunger strike, basically tortured. And yet there was this internal division where there was this ability for nationalist versions of that struggle to arise, and indeed a very big, but not necessarily majority, but not insignificant cohort of the eventual British Union of Fascists. So this I wonder if we can practice a little bit more in the UK context.
Yeah, I guess by the time women get the vote in 1918, and that's women over 30 with property qualifications, and it's only all women over 18 in 1928. If you think about that, like organized suffragist movements, you could trace back 80, 90 years from then. So this is a long struggle. And I think the Pankhurst leg of that struggle, it's always a contested space. So they kind of carve out a space for themselves within that movement through their kind of tactical diversity, through the kind of escalations. They did, if we're talking about, rebellion and conformity, they bombed Asquith and Lloyd George's homes. They spanked Winston Churchill with a horsewhip. They broke windows. They slashed famous paintings. They did a lot of things that are going to get you arrested. And they did a lot of things that, a lot of people in direct action movements now might identify with. Part of that is because of how long that struggle had been. Often the kind of decision to kind of move towards kind of more kind of vanguardist or kind of terroristic forms comes from a frustration with things not worked, or things having been suppressed through liberal reform and not being able to work your way through the system. And I think Sylvia Pankhurst, who was the most kind of generative thinker through that movement, has her own critiques of the kinds of tactics that she was involved in that were led by her sister and mother. But that nationalist streak was there for a long time. It wasn't just that it turned during the First World War. That already existed. That's what makes the Pankhurst trajectory really interesting, because basically they were a family of liberal, middle class. Patriarch of the family was a kind of wannabe liberal MP who was himself a feminist and a woman suffragist. And, Emmeline came from a radical family. So the sisters grew up in this household that had like radicals constantly running through it. It was like an open house. It was one of these really interesting kind of like radical spaces where, you know, Keir Hardie or Louise Michel were all kind of like visiting the house, and that was the kind of culture of it. But the kind of forms that the WSPU took under Emmeline and Christabel had a very authoritarian hierarchical structure from the beginning. They had kind of elitist eugenic ideas from the beginning. And whilst they were on the left, the kind of interface between, you know, the struggle for women's suffrage as a kind of single issue goal, and like combined with, you know, the mixed reception that it received from the different political parties and from the like men on the left, meant that it was this kind of, it was received as this disruptive thing where like there were constantly parliamentary bills for women's suffrage that eventually failed, but there were all these kind of close moments throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century where it seemed close. And so it built on this sense of betrayal, this sense that, you know, you're being betrayed by leftist men, you're being betrayed by the Liberal Party, you're being betrayed by, you know, and when we start to bring through some of the kind of trajectories of women who were not incidental women in the suffragette movement, but women who were right in Emmeline Pankhurst's inner circle. People like Nora Elam, people like Mary Allen, they were lieutenants of the WSPU who were, you know, who became virulent fascists, right? They were, and fascists, like unrepentant fascists until they died in the 50s and 60s. They were involved in fascist activism for more than half of their lives. And, you know, trying to trace those kind of trajectories is always, it is complex, because we're seeing how much the kind of things that the Pankhursts were saying and doing were chiming with the things that these ex-suffragettes who joined the fascist party, British Union of Fascists, see their membership in the British Union of Fascists as a continuation of that struggle.
Yeah, and it's a struggle with, well, I mean, listeners, if you'd like to Google who runs the UK and EU branch of Palantir and who his granddad was, you'll see the British Union of Fascists is very much still here and very much still operative. Yes, in terms of combined recording time, we are coming a bit to the time, but I do have one last question, which is a point which I really want to hammer on. There is no link of necessity here between liberalism and fascism. Liberalism does not have to go to fascism. In many cases, it hasn't. Although in many cases, in our particular historical conjuncture, it does feel like it. Maybe it is going that way. But I just want to quote from the book again, which is that we maintain that there is no straightforward transition from liberalism to fascism or liberal feminism to fascist feminism. But the affinity between early feminism, imperialism, and racial nationalism in the progressive era and interwar period had to be actively and militantly confronted in order to resist that transition. And when it comes to this, so we have to confront when liberalism starts to break down to radicalize in essentially the other direction. There has been intervention here. And when it comes to, is this being a study of the origins of gender critical, transphobic fascism? So listeners, I invited Michael, one of the speakers, to give a talk at my local Marxist organizational branch, and in a sort of an emergency, like quick, oh my God, we have to, discuss this quickly, have a meeting about it, because there was a gender critical fascist rally. Wasn't very big, don't worry. It was, these people mostly produce content for the sake of it, not too far from where I'm based in London. And it does become quite a frustrating thing, especially that transphobia is just a clear pipeline to the far right. And yet in the collapse of, and it's always been a bit, particularly after sort of the collapse of sort of, I don't know, lack of better term, left populist movements, such as Corbynism, the like, various left talking heads have kind of just let this idea of transphobia fester, or become basically converts sacrificing our trans comrades in the name of, at this point, fuck knows what, some money from GB News or something. But just rather than just round up the media landscape, I just wanted to ask, looking at this history, have you found any examples or any hints at where we can collectively make interventions in this transition when you see it happening? Or maybe it's an example like why Sylvia Pankhurst didn't go in this direction, where interventions can be made, where they can be combated. I mean, you give an example at the end of the book, recent cases of liberal intellectuals and recent cases of ostensibly leftist intellectuals who have gone down this pipeline and who have just ended up as fascists or complete collaborators with fascists. I wanted to ask about this particular pipeline, and throughout your historical research, have you found any ways in which we could possibly build up towards combating it?
Yeah, well, I think maybe we should get into the contemporary transitions, but where leftists kind of get into them. I mean, there's two characters in the book, Nina Power and Mary Harrington, two very different people with very different politics. Nina Power, incredibly militant, continental philosopher, very sophisticated critiques, Marxist, who ends up, and we use the example in the book, who ends up at NatCon doing a speech where she sort of transposes a critique of individualism into a lecture presentation to a bunch of conservatives that in the end, what trans is, to Nina Power in this speech, is this threat to children and forming them into corrupted individuals. And that really, well, we can only assume in the speech that the NatCon audience are the ones that have been nominated to protect these children. That's why she's there. But I think I won't go into lots of detail about the speech, but we do kind of analyze it a little bit, because what we're trying to say really through this is that this is someone who, was very influential on myself and Michael as well. And, we see our actions very militant around and kind of uncompromising around, say, the 2011 riots. It wouldn't take any kind of moralizing kind of around this, that had gone on a journey and found themselves at the NatCon conference transposing what I would argue is like quasi or like wrong world Adornian critique into this NatCon format. And, Adorno, we kind of made the point here, Adorno himself is like, no concept is safe. All theory is potential subject to reification this way. And that one of the key things, as you kind of hinted at that, Adam, really, is that where has the work been in expanding the concept of liberation over this last decade, even within those left populist movements? When was transphobia taken seriously as a structural pipeline into the far right of fascism that was going straight up to the state? It was never taken seriously. When these challenges happen within anarchist groups, or, it was always about, oh, well, it used to be a little bit more coherent before this trans thing. And then, these kind of examples would come up. And, it's kind of identity politics breaking a certain kind of coherence to anarchism, which was a class-based movement. When was like the effort, I suppose, the real effort at that point to go, well, what expanded concepts of liberation are we working with here? Where is actually the real struggles taking place? I think the left's got a tendency to get lost in schema around correct positions and what those correct positions or speculations of liberation should be, rather than actually like what's happening. What are the formations emerging? What's the historical context in which these struggles are taking place? How are people pursuing their own resistance against these things? And as you say in the book, with groups of trans anti-fascists and have been instrumental in changing these cultures. But I think thinking about how do we struggle, that it's that old kind of thing. You have to get the left, getting the left to get the house in order. But there's something about that really, that we don't get the house in order around correct positions. We have to get kind of really interrogating auto-critique and self-reflect over where is the meaningful capacities reflection in our movements, where we can go over the fact that we are not resting on some noble heritage at all. We are part of a very complex formation called the left, where at its very best, and Sylvia Pankhurst is a brilliant example of that, like lived contradiction, lived it and analyzed from the perspective of contradiction, didn't repress contradiction, And, that is the key thing for me, really, is those examples, might talk about this, but we do really raise Sylvia Pankhurst's example to a point because it's kind of incredible. I mean, it was so hard to break with family, break loads of abusive partners, try and develop different things in the East End, be a kind of betray whiteness, betray bourgeois class, do all these things to try and form a communist anti-colonial feminism in that context. And so, it's easier for liberal feminists to transition to fascism. We can see that. That's those funnels are there, but it's a lot harder actually to push each other to make those sort of decisions where we don't just fall into what the everyday practices are, say, a kind of left media project is, where we just, we find ourselves in, moving the, I say we, the royal we, I don't think it is a we, but, there's people that within this left ecosystem that we're moving the Overton window and then just totally got absorbed and collapsed into it and find themselves now on conservative panels with outright fascists. So, what all we can do with books like this, really, they're kind of strategies of reflection, auto-critique, sensitize us to those contradictions and to each other. That's kind of it's a humble sort of contribution is the way we see it.
No, I think what you said about Sylvia Pankhurst is really apt because, I think, first of all, the kind of organizing that she did in terms of the East London group that she helped to found. I think because she's a big name, we can maybe because of this, the archive and the name, it means that we tend to privilege individuals like her. But what made her so kind of attuned to maintaining solidarity, to building working class power, was that kind of critical openness. The fact that she was organizing on the ground in a community that was her community or became her community, with working class women, with dockers in the area, with a lot of Jewish women. She founded and edited probably the best and one of the most important radical newspapers of the age for 10 years. She probably was the first person to publish a black writer in Britain, Claude Mackay, the Jamaican communist and poet. So it was about being that the solidarity was practical. When we were writing about the 1919 riots that happened in Britain across different kind of coastal areas, where just very similar to what happened in 2024, just marauding white mobs attacking people of color. She was one of the only sources we could find who on the left who spoke out about it. She wrote stuff in her newspaper about what was happening in London ports, where black sailors were being chased by often organized white sailors. So I think, that kind of bravery, that kind of sense of, non-transactional forms of solidarity. Her newspaper was basically shut down by the state during World War I because she was basically encouraging people to dodge the draft. So imagine left media organizations, really kind of taking those kind of stands that go against, the interests of the colonial state. So I think it's a great example. But I also think that sometimes when we look at these trajectories of individuals, it's very chaotic. It's very a lot of there's that mixture of like what's going on in people's lives and then their kind of political trajectories, and I think it's not I think that we are, if you look at someone like Eldridge Cleaver, whose politics just like absolutely went all over the place over his lifetime. He ends up being a kind of evangelical Reaganite in later life. And, part of that is about his biography and his personality. And part of that is like living under like absolute state repression, and kind of, destitution, like going through these periods of being like extremely famous left celebrity to being completely like living on the street. And I'm not, that this is not to say this as any kind of like excuse or justification for any one individual, but just to say that like, if we have fewer heroes, then there's there's a smaller chance that we focus on kind of betrayals and stuff like that. Like that's quite boring to get stuck just on betrayals. Like I know we talk about some of these individuals in the conclusion of the book, but that's really, it's not about them. I mean, of course we can all like, disdain the kinds of things that they've become and the things that they say, but that's not like the focus of our politics or our organizing. We want to stop those things from happening. And I think what's interesting with some of the people making those transitions is so often they explicate it through a very kind of like open sense of they were mean to me, like they, kind of bad feelings, like the left were mean to me and that's what made me do this. And of course that's not the actual like explanation, and there's a lot, if someone is going on a kind of like, I guess if someone becomes a TERF in this society, that's quite common. Like that's open to people's kind of choice of kind of like political identities in the current kind of conjuncture. But there's a lot of other stuff going on. I think we need to be able to contextualize it, and I think we need to be talking more about conjunctures, like the times that we're living in mean that these things happen, that people take these journeys because we talked in our first book about revolutionary time and about how people can become radicalized in periods of kind of tumult and crisis and heightened struggle. And that's also the case in this kind of like that people's trajectories will also go in these other directions. And it's like, it's just, for me, I'm just trying to understand what's going on. That's like my whole project with like writing with Alex is shit's confusing. I'm trying to understand.
I think that's so right. And I think raising individuals, like you say, it's not about the individuals themselves at all. I think it is about what I say one way that conservative, at their very least left cultures, have compromised and become part of very conservative ecosystems in the media, is with this notion that there's certain correct positions that you can be ideologically sophisticated and protect against the far right, but also protect against internal division. And often people that have taken those lines have found themselves taking very conservative paths. So the key thing really about those two examples of Harrington and Power is, first of all, that the left movements, like say Harrington was involved in, that we were involved in, like Occupy, and the way she talks about Occupy, is that, within that movement, there was lots of sort of ideological schema around what anti-capitalism is. That was never really had any kind of emancipatory potential. It was conservative anyway. You saw this sort of kind of big kind of reactionary anti-capitalism in the 19th century. They were pointing at elites. They were pointing at certain kind of degeneration, certain declinism around society disintegrating, becoming globalized, something authentic being lost. So really, when we use these examples, like Mike said, it's not about personal life, which is complex. There's many reasons why people go down certain paths, but it is that we don't need to get caught up in taking these correct positions. If Mike's right and we're in a conjuncture where there's lots of contingency, then we need to be sort of open to how stuff emerges, and be kind of on our feet, I suppose, like in that way. I think we've been in left movements ourselves, and I do think we talked about this before, before this conversation, that things are changing, and I think people are more open-minded, more multi-tendency on the left than they were, say, 10 years ago, and more open to like, what's the organization like? Is it full of people who are respectable? Is there a certain kind of internal organic democracy in the organization? What kind of intellectual production's being produced there that's kind of opening out to what liberation struggles are happening? I think that's the kind of most important context to be thinking about now in, developing meaningful left capacities than it is getting caught in, look, these are the universalizing positions. These are the divisive ones. We are that because we're not this, which is a kind of things that we've had to unlearn as well. I think this is part of the passage of being radicalized on the left, that you have to unlearn things, and kind of find kind of modes to reflect on them.
No, absolutely. Not being the SWP, sadly, comrades, is not enough. But no, in seriousness, I really want to say it's one of the things I do really appreciate about your works, because it is a question of like political reproduction, and it's really difficult to do political reproduction if we're just trying to reproduce ourselves as less as something which has an actual history and sometimes could be darker than we might necessarily think. Basically, this is the first I've ever seen someone do the phrase, I'm critiquing the left from the left, Because usually when they say I'm critiquing the left from the left, they usually mean I'm leaving the left. Yeah, I'm critiquing left from the left because I'm more radical than you guys, because I'm willing to be rebellious and say slurs. Yeah. This is actually doing history, which is apparently something as leftists we're meant to be quite interested in, but that lot usually aren't. Okay, here's the times when actually we weren't just the good people in a Ken Loach movie who lose anyway. Sometimes we can be, sometimes like the trade union movement can fuck up. We don't have to be in the perspective of the good, plucky upstart losers.
Yeah, and there's reasons for it. I mean, the reasons for that's kind of like, look, we need to defend the noble tradition. We need to defend the best moments. Bring the best moments out. Is because the left's constantly under attack. It's like and a key part of fascism as well is been anti-communism, and that so there's reasons why not to do that, but we should be able to do it between each other. We should be able to like do it in a way that we can.
It's not like anyone else is going to read our stuff anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, it's like what's your book about? It's a critique of the left from the left from the left. It's like you couldn't. It's like the key kind of the key way of alienating. It's key way of decommodifying left literature, I think. But but yeah, I think that it is so. It's very easy to get into post-left positions. That's what we should be looking at as well. Is that it's very easy. Just all of the kind of examples we use where left movements break up, people are really fucked, like psychologically wrecked. Like angry. Where can that go? Loads of different places. That's the rub. So I think if we can build a sort of natural, convivial kind of auto-critique, kind of reflective capacity, giving time to each other, but like not afraid to go into like the dark places and sort of kind of own that we're part that what's authentic to the left, and it does have dark places, and kind of own that. Then it makes it a lot easier to see where we are and act with a little bit more moral consistency, I suppose.
So, listeners, you can buy Fractured Race, Class, Gender and Hatred Identity Politics from our friends over at Pluto Press, but you can also buy the sequel, Fascism and the Women's Cause from our good friends over at Ebb Magazine. We will link both down in the description. Alex, Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Adam. It's really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll catch you folks next time.